All right, I think we're live. Can you guys hear me, see me? Somebody type something in the chat if you can hear me or see me. I think there's maybe a little lag. It begins. Okay, great. So I think it's coming through. If you can't hear me or see me for some reason, just type a message in and let me know. But otherwise, I'll just go ahead and get started. Oh, Dong Chinese. Hey, cool. It looks like we've got a good number of people showing up. That's great. So I'm gonna start about start talking about some kind of unrelated stuff. First, just to give people time to show up, and then in a few minutes, we'll get into the main topic. All right, so I guess before we get into that, a topic that comes up over and over with us. I mean, like I said, this isn't really related to the topic of the video, but people get in touch with us all the time and kind of to disagree with our character explanations, which is fine. I mean, we want to know if we're wrong, so if you can bring evidence to show that we're wrong about something, that's awesome. Well, it looks like I'm having some resolution issues. Well, I think it'll be fine. If there's any problems, just type something in the chat. This is the first time I've done something like this, so. But one of the things that comes up over and over and over again is people trying to claim that a sound component has meaning when our dictionary says that it's only a sound component. And guys, it does happen. I mean, there are sound components that also express meaning. Most of the time, though, when that happens, it's that you originally had one character that was used to write two different meanings, right? And then later, a component. No problem with resolution. Okay, cool. Later, a component was added to the character to create a new character to express one of those meanings, right? So you start with one, and then it splits into two by adding a component. In those cases, the original component is, it expresses both sound and meaning because it was used to write that meaning previously. But usually, in other cases, the thing is, a lot of people, they try to say, like, they come with some real convoluted explanation of, well, one recently that we had was we posted something on Instagram and Facebook about 桌子的桌, and let me see if I can share my screen so I can show you what I'm talking about. Let's see, I think my screen should be sharing now. So 桌, and we said it's this 桌 as a sound component, and 木 is a meaning component. All right, and they're actually, you can see in the full character, they're kind of fused together, like the 木 is fused with the bottom of 桌, right? And this, as a standalone character, this means tall, right? And so the claim that this guy was making was, if you stand on top of a table, you're taller. But that's, I mean, you could make any story to connect two components' meanings. That doesn't mean that's what's really going on. What you have to do to show that something is a semantic component in a character is you actually have to show a direct semantic relationship between the two characters. And there's not a direct semantic relationship between tall and table. I mean, there are low tables. And in order to show that kind of connection, you have to show, like, that people in ancient China had a thing where they would stand on a table to appear taller. Like, that's the only way you could really make that kind of connection. But otherwise, between tall and table, there's no connection. There is a clear connection between wood and table because tables are often made of wood. So that's a really clear, it's called metonymy. It's a type of semantic connection. Um, it's clearly a meaning component. This is clearly a sound component, but there's no real evidence that we've seen to show that it's also a semantic component. So just keep that in mind when you're looking at character explanations. If the meaning connection that people are giving you seems convoluted, it's it's probably a little squirrely. So and most sound components don't express meaning. All right, let me turn my face back on and then get back into the. All right, guys, we've got a lot of people showing up. That's great. 27 right now. People really be out here talking about standing on tables to appear taller. Yeah. I mean, we get all kinds of unusual explanations from people. And we're happy to, if we're wrong about a character explanation, like we're happy to change our dictionary. It's happened before. People have brought stuff to us and said, oh, what about this? And we've gone back to the research and looked into it and changed the dictionary. So we're not here to be right. Well, we're here to be right, but we're not here to defend how right we are. We're here to find what the right answer is and share it with you guys. So, anyway, it is, I guess we're about 5 minutes into it, so probably most of the people that are going to show up are here. So, excuse me. Let me pull up my outline so I don't ramble too much. And guys, you've probably seen this already if you saw the email, but we are running a sale right now. So if there's anything of our stuff that you're wanting, that you've been waiting out for or holding out for, everything in the store is 20% off right now. So that's all of the promotion I'm going to do in this video. So let's get into the main topic. So in a minute, I'm going to talk about what is classical Chinese and what I mean when I talk about classical Chinese in this video. But first, let's talk about why you should learn it. Right? Now, there are some obvious reasons to learn it. Like if you want to be a researcher, like in my field, paleography, you really have to have solid classical Chinese. If you want to be a researcher basically on any aspect of pre-modern China, and even really modern China, you're going to need to be comfortable with at least some stage of classical Chinese. Less obvious reason is that even if you don't have any desire to work with or even to ever read any classical Chinese literature, it's still super helpful for a lot of reasons. I mean, when you're reading Chinese, the more formal the language is that you're reading, the closer it resembles classical Chinese. So like, and especially, and this is niche. It depends on your niche, but if you're going to work in law, let's say, if you've ever read a legal document in Chinese, it's pretty close to classical Chinese. I mean, it's very classically influenced. It's very terse and very precise. But even it even helps in reading things like newspapers. Newspapers tend to be terse also, even in English. They'll drop out articles and stuff like that in English. In Chinese, they're also terse, and Chinese newspapers have a reputation of being difficult to read for learners. But really, if you learn some classical Chinese, it helps a lot because some of the grammar, some of the way of abbreviating things is basically influenced by classical Chinese. So even if you don't ever want to read stuff in classical Chinese, these more formal registers of the language tend to be closer to classical, and so having some knowledge, you don't have to have super in-depth knowledge, but having some knowledge of it really helps when you get to the more advanced levels. So if you're planning to learn Chinese to a high level, and especially if you're planning to use it professionally at some point, classical Chinese really helps, more than you would expect. And an even less obvious reason to learn it is it's actually fun. as nerdy as that sounds. But we're all about nerdy stuff here. So there's a lot of really interesting stuff to read in classical Chinese. I remember, so I was in a classical Chinese reading group in Taipei. This was 8 years ago, 9 years ago, maybe. No, I think 9 years ago. And I remember the first passage we read was it was interesting. It wasn't really my thing, but the second one we read was like a description of a battle, an ancient battle that happened. It's Gaixia Zhiwei, and I've got a copy of it here. I'll show you in a minute, but well, I got to get used to this format because I'm not editing this, so it's I can't put subtitles up here when I speak in Chinese. I can't give you the characters, so let me see if I can get this to show up. I don't know if that's going to show up very well or not, but here, Gai Xia Zhi Wei, and it's from, I think it's from Shi Ji, as they call it in English, the Records of the Grand Historian. And it's just a passage about an ancient battle, and it's a really fun read. It's not super difficult. I had been learning classical Chinese for a few months when I read it, and at the time, I mean, it was difficult to get through it because it's a fairly long passage compared to what I had read before that, but it was perfectly manageable. And it's a really fun, entertaining read. We read stuff like there's a book from the Qing Dynasty called Zibuyu, and it's like there was a passage in the Lunyu, the Confucian Analects, that says like Zibuyu, like Confucius doesn't speak about, blah 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 blah, ghosts and gods, and I forget what the passage says exactly, but so this Qing Dynasty collection of short stories is like there's like zombie tales, and there's just all kinds of like crazy stuff in there, and so there's fun stuff to read. There's classical poetry if you're into poetry. The Chinese poetic tradition is extremely rich. There's just all kinds of interesting stuff to read in classical Chinese. So those are some reasons to learn it. I think it's a really good idea to learn it, no matter what your goal is with Chinese, whether you're an academic or whether you're just wanting to learn it to a high level. It's really useful. Let's see, we've got a few comments. Yeah, okay, so show that people in ancient China stood on tables. Zhuo is a relatively new character, though, right? It's from Ming. No, there's actually, there are examples of zhuo the zhuo in excavated texts from the Warring States period. And meaning table. So I haven't traced the history of the character from the Warring States all the way up to the modern. But yeah, no, there are examples of that character being used in Warring States texts. And I believe I don't think it's in the Schwollen, but I believe there's other. I'll have to look at it. I'll look at it some more after the video's over. But yeah, but the point stands. I mean, they'd have to show that people were standing on tables in the Ming Dynasty if that was the earliest, being able to read a newspaper is my ultimate goal. Yeah, it really is held up as a pretty high standard. But learning classical Chinese really helps, and there's some good textbooks. I don't have them with me today, but there's some good textbooks from Taiwan, and I'm sure from the mainland too. So about helping you to learn to read Chinese newspapers. Okay, so next topic. So we talked about why to learn it. Another thing is philosophy. Chinese philosophy is a really rich tradition too. I have Zhuangzi here, Zhuangzi reader. He's a lot of fun to read. He's very creative. Not everything in Zhuangzi was actually, I mean, it was compiled over a few hundred years, so it's not all one author, but it's still pretty interesting stuff. So next is, what is classical Chinese? I mean, and you're talking about a language that spans thousands of years, right? From the earliest books that we have, like the Shi Jing, the classic poetry, Shangshu, historical book. Um, some people would consider those pre-classical, maybe, um, but at least from like spring and autumn period up until, which spring and autumn is what, 400 or 500 BC, something like that. I'm not super great with dates on this stuff, but all the way up to the Qing dynasty and early Republican period, right? So you're talking about well over 2,500 years at least, but really it goes back further than that. Um, but people generally divide it up into two big categories. I mean, you can talk very specifically about, you know, Buddhist literature in the Tang Dynasty, and that's going to be a very different style from like Taoist philosophy in the Warring States period. You know, I can read Taoist philosophy in the Warring States period. I cannot read Buddhist literature. It's just I don't have any exposure to it. Um, I don't know much about it, so it's like I'm sure I could learn to read it, but it's a whole different category. But overall, you've got two main categories. You've got classical Chinese, which is like spring and autumn, Warring States, Qin Dynasty, Han Dynasty. And then you've got anything after that, which they categorize as literary Chinese. So classical Chinese is Gu Wen, literary Chinese is Wen Yan Wen. A lot of people use the terms interchangeably. Today, I'm going to use them basically interchangeably. I'm just going to say classical Chinese. Um, but you can really get pretty granular with how you define this stuff. Um, and of course, poetry is going to be different from any of that. So there's tons of different styles, and to really get good at any of them, you have to focus. But it's good to learn what I call kind of the mainstream of classical Chinese. Whether you want to read like something outside of that mainstream, like Buddhist sutras, um, or something like that. And I probably keep coming back to that example because for me it's my blind spot. I don't know how to read that, so for me that's like uh, that's an quick, easy example of something else. Um, but it's good to learn the mainstream regardless of where you want to focus because, as I said earlier, modern Chinese, formal modern Chinese, is influenced heavily by that mainstream of classical Chinese, which is basically, Taoist and Confucian texts, and then later literary styles that were influenced by that, which is also confusingly enough called Guben. So you have a compilation of classical literature called Guwen Guanzhi. Right? Guwen Guanzhi. And it's stuff all the way from spring and autumn period up until the Qing dynasty, I think, or maybe the Ming dynasty. And it's called Guwen. But it's that style of writing that I think everybody should learn, and then if you have other interests, you can focus on those other interests too. Um, there are good books out there for people who want to focus on specific things. Um, like, for example, if you want to focus on Chinese poetry. I'm not super familiar with Chinese poetry. I've read some. But there's a good textbook, or it's highly recommended. I haven't actually used it myself, but I've heard great things about it, called Chinese Through Poetry by Archie Barnes. um, so if you want to focus on poetry, that may be a good beginner's textbook to start with. I'm going to mostly talk about stuff that I've used today because that's what I have here with me. but I will try to recommend other things as we go. Okay, so now I guess let me check in the comments and see if there's anything I need to address. Let me see. Join excavated text, didn't know that. Yeah, there's so back to the Zhuozi thing. There's 古文字类编 is a compendium. I can get the page number. I'll try to post it in the comments later. But let's see. To me, it's a different way of thinking, which is one reason it's so much fun. Yeah, that's for sure. It's that's part of why I like Zhuangzi so much, right? Because it's um, pretty unusual. It's pretty creative philosophical writing. It's a lot of fun. Would you recommend B2 level first before attempting classical Chinese? Not necessarily. Um, B2 is higher than I think what you need to have before you start. You can wait that long if you want, but like the textbook I'm going to recommend is going to be it's aimed at people who have had like I think 2 semesters or 2 years of college Chinese, something like that. I started when I was like I think my first near the end of my first semester in Taiwan. So I was at a level that was like I was comfortable with ordering food and asking for directions and stuff, but I wasn't super conversational. I was like a high beginner level. Outlier linguistics character base. Can you speak about how classical Chinese might have helped you get a deeper understanding of individual characters? Yeah, I'll come back to that though. We're going to do a Q&A session at the end, by the way. So that one I'll come back to in the Q&A. Only know Japanese. Being interested in classical Chinese, biggest obstacle is how to approach reading. Should I basically learn Chinese first, or should I use onyomi? Okay, so there is a tradition in Japan of reading classical Chinese texts. They call it kanbun. Kanbun is like in Chinese is hanwen. So han meaning Chinese and wen meaning literature. And they have their own tradition of how to read these texts. There's like I don't know much about it. There's markup that they do to the text to make it more grammatically Japanese in order to read it. So if your Japanese is good, I'm sure there's tons of good textbooks for that in Japanese. I wouldn't recommend learning Chinese just to learn classical Chinese if you're not interested in Chinese otherwise. There's also, I think there are textbooks for non-native speakers, Kanbun textbooks for non-native speakers. I know they teach it at the IUC in Yokohama. I don't know what book they use, or they may have developed their own materials. I'm not sure. Um, yeah, sorry, I don't know much about reading classical Chinese from a Japanese background. Although some of the books I'm recommending do talk about it. Like there's a book by Paul Rauser um, that he's written it basically to be accessible to anyone who may need to learn it for their language. So like if you're learning Japanese or Korean, um, he gives glosses in those languages in his beginner's textbook. So famous classical Chinese would be the most accessible to people just starting to read classical Chinese. Um, I'll come back to that, I think, during the Q&A too. Um, and we'll probably answer that a little bit on the way. So, all right, so I'm basically just going to talk about what I did. And it worked very well for me. I did a lot of like researching how to learn classical Chinese while I was learning, and a lot of like talking to people online on Chinese forums, especially. Um, so I'll share what I did, and I'll recommend some other things on the way. Let me get back over to my outline. Uh, okay, so one thing is I've noticed when people ask online, how do I learn classical Chinese? A lot of native speakers will jump in. I've seen this on Quora, for example, or on Reddit sometimes. Native speakers will come in and they'll say things like, start with stuff from the Qing dynasty. That's the most recent dynasty, and then work your way back. And I'm going to recommend the exact opposite. It makes sense if you're a native speaker, if you're already fully literate in Chinese. Um, it may make sense to start with Qing Dynasty because that's going to be closer to the modern language, right? But if you're learning, if you're at, say, an intermediate level in Chinese, I really would recommend starting with classical Chinese, like, the early stuff. And that, excuse me, sorry guys, let me take some water. That's because it'll it'll give you a good grammatical foundation if you start with the early stuff, because that's what the later stuff is based on. So you almost have to approach it as though you're learning two different languages. It's not quite that, that sounds like it's going to be really difficult. It's not quite that difficult, but you kind of need to think of it that way. You start with modern Chinese on one end, and you start with really old classical Chinese on the other end, and then you can kind of move up if you want to read later stuff. But and most textbooks for non-native speakers will take that approach. They'll start with the early stuff. So this is what I used: An Introduction to Literary Chinese by Michael Fuller. It's a fantastic textbook. It's pretty in depth. He gives you a lot of exercise. I'm going to try to show. I had a different camera set up, but then I couldn't get it to work. It kind of crapped out on me right before the broadcast started, or before the stream started. I'll try to get it working next time. It's better quality, but so let's see the contents. The introduction is really nice. It really sets the stage. The sketch of literary Chinese is very useful. And then part one, you basically learn the basic grammar of classical Chinese. And don't let all the terminology scare you off. It's not that hard to grasp. And he gives you, as you can see, like passages from classical literature. So you start with 论语 and 韩非子, 春秋, 韩非子, the 列子, 战国策, 孟子. So this is all like pretty much all warring states or Han Dynasty. So it's all classical texts. And what's good about this stuff is he gives you like further reading and other exercises. Like he'll assign you things like go find such and such dictionary and look up this character or look up this person and find out about them. So it gives you practice with using like dictionaries of classical Chinese, which you need. So speaking of that, this one is really good. This is 古汉语常用字字典. I believe it's by Wang Li, who is, edited by Wang Li, who was a very famous and influential linguist. We use his stuff all the time when we're researching for the dictionary. But this is good because it gives fairly short, it's not a super comprehensive, in-depth dictionary. It gives fairly short entries for most of the stuff. So it'll give you a definition, it'll give you pronunciation, and then it'll give you a few examples of it being used in classical literature. And that's enough when you're starting out. There's also on Plico, there's a dictionary called A Student's Dictionary of Classical and Medieval Chinese. It's by Paul Kroll. I don't have it, I'm ashamed to admit. It came out, I guess, once I had already gotten pretty comfortable using native dictionaries. I've been told by my friends in academia and by professors that it's fantastic. And the fact that it's available for Plico is just awesome. So if you're learning classical Chinese, I recommend taking a look at that. But also this book, like I said, it's affordable. I forget what I think I paid $12 for it or something like that when I got it. And it's super useful. This is the traditional character version. You can get a simplified character version if you want. It's available. But I would recommend, if you're learning classical and you're learning simplified, it might be a good time to start learning traditional as well. This textbook is all in traditional. A lot of textbooks for non-native speakers learning classical Chinese are going to be in traditional. So that's probably a good opportunity to get familiar with it. As I've said before, you're going to have to know both at some point anyway. So at least getting some exposure to it is good. But fortunately, the Plico dictionary, of course, you can toggle between both character sets. But anyway, yeah, this book is great. It gives you further reading. It gives you exercises. It gives you translation exercises. It gives you context. So you might only read a few lines from something, and it'll give you like the whole passage at the end of the chapter. It gives you references to Pulley Blank, which this is another one. If you're just starting out, this book is awesome. You might have it in a library near you. If not, I recommend just picking it up. Now, I will say it seems in Taiwan, his grammatical analysis of classical Chinese isn't, I don't want to say it's not held in high regard. It may just be they prefer other scholars. I don't really know. It's not talked about very much, but for learners, this is fantastic. He gives really good explanations of stuff. He gives tons of examples. It really helped me a lot when I was learning the grammar. So, and like I said, Fuller's book refers to it a lot. I believe Rausser's book, so Paul Rausser's book is, this is an introduction to literary Chinese. Rausser's book is called, I forget what it's called, sorry, A New Practical Primer of Literary Chinese. It's published by Harvard, I believe. Well, no, this one's published by Harvard. Maybe they both are. I have that book at home. I don't have it here with me, but it's also fantastic. So if you don't want Fuller, or if you have easier access to Rausser, actually, I believe Rausser is available online. So if you Google Paul Rausser, Rouzer, A New Practical Primer of Literary Chinese, I think it's available online. So anyway, and then we get into so once you finish the basic intro to grammar, then you get into part 2. Let's see, intermediate texts. And so these are less lessons, or I mean, they're not teaching you specific, grammar points and stuff like that. It's more, it gives you a text at the beginning, it gives you a vocab list, it gives you explanatory notes. That helps a lot. And you'll find even in stuff for native speakers, you get this stuff too. You get the explanatory notes because you really need the explanation a lot of times in order to really understand what you're reading. Even if you understand grammatically, you might not get the references and stuff, and so that's what the notes are for. It gives you some questions, some review exercise, sentence patterns to work on or to learn. And then, again, bibliographic exercises. Locate the account of this guy in Shiji 39. What part of the Shiji is this chapter? Does this person play a role? Blah, blah, blah. There's a lot of good stuff in here that it basically teaches you step by step and builds it up from a very easy level, but teaches you to be able to do things like read classical commentary, to get comfortable with using reference works like I said, dictionaries, and I think there's atlas exercises, like historical atlas, and there's just all kinds of stuff. You don't have to do all the exercises, of course, but it really does help you to get comfortable with this stuff. And again, the selection of texts in this is also really good. So here's the intermediate texts. So again, a lot of Shiji, Mengzi, Hanfeizi, Zhuangzi. So yeah, just really good stuff. And then you get into the advanced texts. You start getting into Mengzi Xuan. So selections from Mengzi, selections from Zhuangzi, passage from Shiji, Lanting Ji Xu. There's a real famous work. by Wang Xizhi. So yeah, there's a lot of good stuff, and then once you get through that, I don't think I finished this book actually. I think that's as far as I went. I went through the advanced text section, and then the next 6 chapters. There's 35 chapters total. Selected Tang and Song Dynasty writings. And this is good stuff. I did read some of these selections later in other contexts, but not in the book. Actually, it looks like, yeah, about half of these I've read, or maybe more. But there's really good stuff in here. But basically, at the end of the advanced text section, what I did is, well, two things. I joined the classical Chinese reading group in Taipei and discovered that I could actually read classical Chinese after finishing this book, or after finishing the first 3 sections. Because we would do a different text selection every week, and basically like prepare it on your own at home, read through it, do basically the best you could, and then show up and discuss it in the reading group. And I was really excited to find out that I could do it. I think the first text we read was this Lan Ting Ji Xu. This number 28. I think that's the first one we read, so I guess I must have joined before I finished section 3 of this. But I was able to get through it, and then the next thing that we read, I think, was Gai Xia Zhi Wei, the battle that I was talking about. And yeah, it was a challenge, but it was very doable. And so my modern Chinese at the time was about an intermediate level. And I think I spent about 4 months, 3 or 4 months going through Fuller's textbook. Now that's probably pretty quick unless you're studying full time. I was studying full time at the time, so I was on scholarship, and that's basically all I had to do. So it'll probably take you longer if you're not in that sort of situation. But yeah, once I was able to do it, once I finished that book, I was able to basically sit down and read stuff. I had to work through it. I had to use a dictionary, of course. I had to use the Pulley Blanks grammar reference. But it was doable. I felt confident that I could read at least most of the things that I would need or want to read at that stage. Of course, there's stuff that's much more difficult. There's still plenty of stuff that's super challenging for me, like Shangshu. Shangshu is hard. It's old, or I would say a lot of people would call it pre-classical Chinese. It's very terse. It's very difficult. You have to read a lot of notes, but it's probably not for most people, I would say. What I did after that, of course, I was in the reading group, so we were reading stuff every week. But I also went through this book, A First Course in Literary Chinese, Harold Shattuck. And this is a classic textbook. I think it was published in the 60s. And it does say a first course. So it is meant for beginners. But Volume 2 and Volume 3, at least 9 years ago when I was learning this stuff, those 2 volumes were out of print. And those are the volumes that contain all of the vocabulary glosses and the grammar explanations and the notes and all that stuff. Volume 1 is just the texts. There's there may be some notes, but it's pretty much just texts. And again, there's a really great selection of texts in this book. So what I did, after I finished Fuller, here's some of the texts. So it's good stuff. Going the wrong way, my camera is backwards. So again, 孟子, 墨子, 庄子, the standard, the usual suspects. But then it also goes into later stuff. I use this as a reader. So I basically started from the beginning and worked my way through the book, using it as a reader instead of as a textbook. And because I'd learned how to read it, how to read classical Chinese from Fuller, and I had learned how to look stuff up in the various reference books that I needed. So I just worked my way through this book I don't think I did the whole thing again. Like I did probably 2/3 of it, or maybe a little more. Um, and it's good. It's really good stuff, and it goes all the way up. I believe, yeah, 武士. It goes all the way up to like I believe it's 20th century, right? Um, so yeah, it starts with the older stuff and then works its way forward. You've got a lot of like 欧阳修、韩愈, um, 苏轼. So yeah, there's a lot of later stuff in this book too. And then you even have things like lesson 28, 辞海. So you have like selections. 辞海 is like an dictionary of Chinese. And so it has reading selections from 辞海. Um, so yeah, it's really useful, and it's got a fairly broad scope, especially for a beginner's textbook. So that's basically, if I were to recommend somebody like how to learn classical Chinese, that's it in a nutshell. Start with an intro textbook like Fuller or Rouser or Archie Barnes. He has another one. Archie Barnes has another book called Du's Handbook of Classical Chinese Grammar, I think, which is also supposed to be quite good. Again, I don't have any experience with it. But yeah, so this or one of the other options, Holy Blank's Grammar, a dictionary, and the one in Plico as well, if that's useful to you. And then this as a reader. That's like, for most people, that's enough. Unless you want to specialize in classical text, or you want to, really spend a lot more time working with them, that's probably enough. Or it's at least enough that you can branch out and start doing your things. You don't necessarily have to do any more like textbook stuff. But you can. There's a lot of textbooks actually. I brought some of them, but let me take a look at comments real quick to see if there's anything I need to address before I move on to the next section. Great book at Untitled. Did I self-study the Fuller or use it in class? Oh, that's a good question. Yeah, I meant to mention this. I self-studied. I never took a classical Chinese class. I solely self-studied. And I remember I was talking to my teacher about that at the Mandarin Training Center in Taipei. And I was in, for any of you who have studied in Taiwan, I was in the Practical Chinese Reader Book 2. I think we'd finished Book 2 and moved on to the beginning of Book 3, but that's the type of level I was at when I started. It's low, intermediate, high beginner, I would say. If that. I mean, high beginner is probably accurate. And she didn't believe that I could teach myself classical Chinese. And so she like opened the book, turned to a page, and asked me to read. She was like, "What does this mean?" And of course, there's a tradition of translating classical Chinese into modern Chinese. The Baihua, they call it, translation to Baihua. I didn't, of course, I'm not very good at that even still. That's a separate skill from being able to read it, but it is very useful. But so I basically paraphrase what the line said in classical Chinese. I paraphrase it in my like upper beginner Mandarin, and she was kind of like, "Yeah, how did you do that?" And I'm like, "Well, I've got this great textbook." But also, if you're self-studying, there's a lot of stuff online. So at the time, I'm still kind of active, but at the time I was really active on Chinese forums. Let me get rid of that. ChineseForums.com. There's a classical Chinese discussion board on Chinese forums, and they have a bunch of discussion threads about the chapters in the Fuller book, and I believe they have a bunch about the Rouser book too. And so most of the questions that I had, or things that I wasn't able to translate myself or figure out myself, somebody else had already asked, and it had been answered. And things that hadn't been asked yet, I would ask, and I would usually get a pretty helpful answer. So there's a lot of stuff on there. If you have questions, I would recommend looking for those threads on Chinese forums and even posting them. It's totally cool to, like, those threads are years and years old, but you can totally bump them. And you know, probably most of the people that were participating at the time aren't still around, aren't still posting there, but um, there's still a lot of good info there, and other people will jump in and help you. So, um, all right, so let's see. Is there still a classical email a list of all these books you're talking about in a follow-up newsletter? Yeah, sure. And I'll make the outline available too, if that's, I don't know if that'll be useful to anybody. But is there still a classical Chinese reading group in Taipei? Not that I know of. It went on for a few. I mean, maybe there's another one now, but it wouldn't be the same one that we started. We had it. We ran it for a good 2 or 2.5 years. The first year it was a bunch. It was mostly academic types, so it was people that were like working on their PhD, or people like me. I was preparing to go to grad school. So yeah, mostly academic types. The second year was completely different. It turned into more of like me teaching, and we went through Fuller basically. Um, and then it kind of fizzled out after that. If I remember right, somebody else took over running the group because I was in grad school by that point, and I just didn't have time to do it. But yeah, it kind of fizzled out. Um, Started learning classical while intermediate and modern Chinese. Did one help the other out, or anything else you noticed? Yeah, for sure. I mean, you may have missed earlier in the video. I talked about modern Chinese, especially formal modern Chinese, is very close to classical, and so learning some classical really helps when you're learning to read things like newspapers and stuff like that. So I spend more time talking about it at the beginning of the live stream. So once we're done recording, you can go back and kind of watch that section. But yeah, I mean, knowing classical Chinese really helps with your modern Chinese. Of course, knowing modern Chinese helps with your classical Chinese because you've already got exposure to the characters. You'll know a lot of the vocabulary and stuff like that. So yeah, they definitely build off of each other. Um, so I think we may be going longer than I was planning to, but I don't mind. If you guys don't, we can keep going. I was planning to keep it at about an hour, including a Q&A session, but we're at 48 minutes so far, I think. So, um, but okay, this is another textbook I would recommend if you want to go further, or if you're already at an upper intermediate level or an advanced level in modern Chinese. So this is a textbook from ICLP, which is a school in Taipei. And it's one of the best Chinese language schools in the world. Most of their materials you can't buy elsewhere. You have to be an ICLP student. This is one of the exceptions. Um, and it's really good. It's meant for people, like I said, who already have a decent level in modern Chinese, because there's not very much, if any, I don't think there's any English in the book. It's meant for non-native learners, but you can see, like, the texts are all glossed in Chinese, right? So if your Chinese is at that level, I would still recommend going through more like a beginner's textbook first. But this is quite good. The texts um, that it teaches are a little more difficult. I think there's some overlap. There's some famous stuff in here like Yu Gong Yi Shan. That's a famous story of a guy that was he had two mountains blocking the path in front of his house, and so he moved the mountains one bucket at a time. Um, and it's a Yu Gong Yi Shan is a famous Chengyu, so they've got the original story there. There's a lot of good stuff, and then again it goes from early, let's see, Qian Qin, so before the Qin dynasty, through Han Dynasty and all the way up to Qing and Mingguo, so like Republican period. There's a lot of good selections, and if I remember correctly, the texts in this they're specifically chosen not to overlap with Gu Wen Guanzhi, because at ICLP, after you do this, you do this. So that's the next step if you're focusing on classical Chinese at ICLP. They probably use a different version of the book, but yeah, so this is a good one. If you want more textbooks after that, you're basically talking about stuff for native speakers. And I'll do a quick overview of those real quick. Let me see. Do you think knowing Japanese would help learning classical Chinese or vice versa? I guess probably. My Japanese isn't really that great, so it's hard for me to say. And of course, I learned Japanese what little I know after learning Chinese. So, but I would guess so. I was talking to a friend yesterday, actually, asking about like, can most Japanese people, like educated Japanese people, read classical Chinese? Just sit down with kanbun and read it. She was like, yeah, sure. Now, of course, there's going to be exceptions. Like some texts are quite difficult and whatnot, but and she's not an academic; she's a businesswoman. So it seems to me that I'm a little outside of my element here, but yeah, it seems to me that there's probably good resources available in Japanese, and it's probably quite common for Japanese people to know this stuff. And would it help? Yeah, I guess. I guess it would help. It's hard for me to speak on that too much because I don't have any experience with it. So, but yeah, I would think so. So okay, back to textbooks. So there's Wang Li, Gudai Hanyu. So this is the same Wang Li that made this dictionary, right? This is like a standard university classical Chinese textbook. It was published, I think, in the 70s. You can still get it. It's still published. It's still widely used in universities. It's 18 renminbi, right? So it's quite affordable. There's 4. So this is volume 1. There's 4 volumes. There's also a companion study guide, 2 volumes. So I don't think I used the study guide, but I think the first volume is for volumes 1 and 2 of the textbook, and then the second volume of the study guide is for volumes 3 and 4. I mean, this is the granddaddy. It's super in depth. If you need a really solid academic grounding in classical Chinese, you won't go wrong with this. It's for most people, it's probably overkill. But if you are, like I said, if you're going to be in academia working with classical Chinese, you'll want to pick this up. You'll learn about things like rhyming schemes in Middle Chinese poetry, like Tang Dynasty poetry. You'll learn it's super comprehensive. Like I said, 4 volumes. Volume 1 is the skinniest by far, and it's 360 something pages, 370 pages. So that's, if you need a really comprehensive academic grounding in classical Chinese, that's the one. There's other ones you can also use. I really like this one. It's 古代汉语教程, right? I don't know if this is still available. I assume it probably is. I bought this in Taiwan, but it's published in China, in Wuhan. So, and it's also really good. And if I remember right, it's got it's a different one I'm thinking. Oh no, it does. It has even oracle bone texts and stuff. So it's the Wang Li book is basically only received texts. This one also does a little bit with excavated texts. So if you're interested in that aspect of things, this is a good one to pick up. And then there's also another one called Dai Hanyu. And this was published, the blue one was published 2008, so it's probably still in print. This one was published, I think, about the same time. So it is probably also in print. Oh, and it's also from Wuhan. So this is Wuhan University Press. The other one is a different university, I think. Those are all good. If you have access to them. If you live in China or Taiwan, they'll be pretty easy to pick up. In Taiwan, you would go to Wanjuanlou. It's close to Guting Station in Taipei. They'll have this stuff. Of course, they've changed their catalog recently, so they might not carry as much as they used to, but they can tell you where to find it anyway. But most people don't need that stuff. I mean, the university textbooks, if you're not going to be in academia, you probably don't need it. If you want something beyond the textbooks for non-natives that I was recommending, again, Guwenguanzhi is really good. This particular edition I really like because it's got pronunciation next to each character. It's got notes on the same page. Or wait, that may be, yeah, notes. And then at the bottom, I think it's at the bottom is the modern translation. Yeah, that's what it is. So, and it's all on the same page. There's other editions of Guwenguanzhi where you have to read on one page and you flip a few pages over to find the notes. And then if it does have a modern translation, it's a few pages over from that. This has got all on one page, which is really nice. And this is published in Taiwan, I believe. By Jian'an or An Jian, I'm not sure. Oh, yeah, Jian'an Chubanshe. Pretty sure it's published in Taiwan. Yeah, and it was 300 NT, which is what, like $10. So if you're in Taiwan, or you can order on books.com.tw, this is a really good one. Other good ones that I used, this is like a kind of a high school textbook or study book, 文言文40篇大探索. I'm not sure this is still published, but there's going to be other ones like it that are published still in Taiwan. And again, you've got modern Chinese translation, you've got notes, all kinds of stuff. It's really good. It's intended for high school students getting ready for the university entrance exam, if I remember correctly. Another one in a similar vein, 高中国文全译本要版, right? Should have practiced that beforehand. But, and it's similar format as 古文观止. So text on top, translation bottom, etc. And again, this is different. This is I thought it was Jian'an, but it's Jian Hong. And oddly enough, the logo is very similar. Yeah, Jian Hong Press in Taiwan. 420 NT, so what, 12, 15 bucks, something like that. All right, some questions. Rhyme in the poetry. Curious how people know what ancient Chinese sounded like. Oh, that's a whole different topic. There's a good article on Wikipedia about Middle Chinese and Old Chinese that kind of touches on that. But yeah, that would have to be a topic for another video, I think. Or maybe if I have time in the Q&A, I'll talk about it a little bit. But missed my question about how to start a reading group in Taipei. I work in Taipei, but not any of the universities. Okay, so the way we started our group is, if I remember right, now this was 9 years ago, but I saw at the Mandarin Training Center, there's like a bulletin board on the 5th floor or 6th floor, I forget, 4th floor. Anyway, it's a bulletin board where people can post, they usually post ads for like language exchange or roommates wanted, stuff like that. But there was a post, like a flyer there about, some guy wanting to start a classical Chinese reading group. And so I texted him, and he had a couple of friends that were interested, and I think we went to ICLP and posted something there too, because we knew that there would be some like academically minded people at ICLP. So yeah, I mean, I believe anyone can post to that bulletin board in at the MTC. I don't think you have to be a student there. You can just walk in and stick something on there. So that might be a good place to start. And I'm sure there's like Facebook groups for people living in Taiwan. There's probably Facebook groups for people studying Chinese in Taiwan. That may be a good place to start. And we just met at, I don't think it's there anymore, but it was a cafe. I'm not sure I can even remember what it's called. It was a little cafe that had like coffee, and they had a bunch of different Belgian beer and stuff. And so we would just go, and most of us would order a beer and drink that while we were discussing the text. So yeah, it was a lot of fun. Finish up with my book recommendations section, and then we can move on to a little more Q&A. So guys, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in, and I'll try to get to them in the Q&A. But this is another, this is for people who aren't specializing in classical Chinese in university, but still need it for whatever reason, or maybe it's a requirement for your degree. 大学国文选. So this is like those high school books that I mentioned, but for university students. So the passages are going to be a little more difficult. I haven't used this one very much. I've glanced through it, and it seems pretty good. Another one that's really good, and this is if your classical and modern Chinese are at a fairly decent level. This series is called 古今文选. Now, I heard about this series from Professor Victor Mayer at University of Pennsylvania. He has a blog, and he talked about how while he was learning Chinese in Taiwan, this was like his go-to. And so I went and bought the first 4 volumes. I think there's 12 altogether, or 15. I don't know, there's a lot. But it was a weekly or monthly publication. I'm not sure when. I forget when. 40年. So in the 50s, 60s, I think. And it's, like I said, 古今文选. And every week it was basically they would send, or every month, whatever it was, if subscribers to this would get, it's like a newspaper. I mean, it's published by 国语日报, which is 国语日报. It's a newspaper. The thing about 国语日报, I think, I'm speaking from memory here, so I may get this wrong, but I believe it's a newspaper for kids, like for middle schoolers in Taiwan. And so every character has 注音符号 next to it, so you have the pronunciation. Every single character, even in the notes, even in the modern translations, even in the biography section, where they're talking about the author. Every single character in this book has a pronunciation beside it, so that's super useful. And it's not all classical Chinese. It's classical and modern. That's why it's 古今, right? So classical and modern literature selections. And there's just hundreds. I forget how many hundreds of selections there are, but it's hundreds of them. I don't remember how much these cost. They're affordable, though. I mean, books in Taiwan tend to be very affordable, but these are fantastic. Highly recommend it. And you can also, I showed this earlier, 庄子读本. This series, this Teal jacket series, is published by Sanmin Shuju. This series is awesome, and they're super widely available. They're very affordable. They're they're compiled by experts, by scholars in the field. They're not necessarily aimed at academics. They're aimed at an educated, native speaking audience. So if you want the authoritative thing meant for academics, this is not what you're looking for. If you're wanting a convenient way to read tons of different classical literature, this series is awesome. They're available in Taiwan at pretty much any bookstore. There is a Sanmin bookstore where they have all of it. I think there's a few locations of that bookstore, but most bookstores will carry it. Used books, I got this at Molly's, which I think is closed now. It's close to Shattuck. I spent 40 NT for this, guys, just a little over $1. And there's tons of used copies. Any used bookstore is going to have a bunch of these too. So if you're in Taiwan, these are awesome. If not, again, books.com.tw. You can order books from Taiwan there. And then there's other stuff, like I really enjoy reading Shiji. It's history, but it's interesting, it's well written, it's not super difficult. Classical Chinese. It's a lot of fun, and a lot of the stories in Shiji are very famous in Chinese culture, so it really helps you to know, some of the references. And if you can make the references yourself, you may end up impressing some native speakers. It's kind of fun. So that's all my book recommendations, guys. I mean, there's tons I could recommend. There's so much more, but that I think covers what you need in order to get competent with classical Chinese. And of course, the Wang Li stuff, if you want to get to a super advanced level, that's got you covered. If you want to get into more specialized stuff, I didn't really cover much of that. But this, I think what I've mentioned here should be enough, at least to get anybody started. And for most people, it's enough. Especially if you don't really intend to read much classical Chinese, if you just want it to help with your modern Chinese. Those first couple of books that I recommended, those are the ones. Let's see, you guys are awesome. Got all outlier versions in both courses. Keep up the good work. Thanks, man. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's we weren't really sure about the courses when we first did them. We weren't sure if they would do well. I'm not really much of a teacher. I've never taught like professionally. I've done tutoring and stuff, but I've never like taught in front of the classroom. Ash has more, but yeah, it's been really great to see the response we've gotten to the courses. And what's really cool is when people get in touch and they say like, I've been struggling with characters for years and this finally helped. Or, there's one person in our pronunciation course that when she first started posting recordings of herself, it was like, man, we've got our work cut out for us. And then just a few lessons later, she sent us recordings and it was like massively improved. So that was very, very cool to see. So yeah, I appreciate the kind words. Hell yeah, I wish more literature had zhuyin. Yeah, it's really nice. For people, so before I moved to Taiwan, it was really common for people to not learn pinyin, to just learn zhuyin fuhao, or bapamafa as they call it. And so I wonder if it would be different. Like, I'm not super comfortable with zhuyin. I can read it just fine, but it's not, like, I have to think about it sometimes. Because I learned it after just because I knew I needed it for reading stuff like that, or because that's how people in Taiwan think of, most people in Taiwan don't know Hanyu Pinyin. Or if they do, they don't really like it that much because they learn zhuyin in school. What's nice though about zhuyin is that, for me at least, it's really easy to ignore unless I need it. So I can just read the Chinese, and then if there's a character I don't know the pronunciation for, or I've forgotten the pronunciation for, I can look over the zhuyin. But otherwise, my vision basically blocks it out, which is not the case with pinyin because it's it's written in the alphabet, so my eyes automatically gravitate to it. Even still, I've been working with Chinese for a long time now, but my eye is still going to gravitate to the Latin characters. How do you feel about using programs like Anki while learning classical Chinese. I found it useful myself, but I know some people dislike it. I thought it was super useful. In fact, I don't think I have this deck anymore, but when I was studying Fuller, um, that's this one again. I actually made an Anki deck, or maybe an Aplico flashcard deck. I was using both at the time. I think it was an Anki deck with all of his vocabulary um, entries. So a lot of times, vocabulary characters in classical Chinese a lot of times will have, excuse me, different meanings than they do in modern Chinese. Sometimes the meanings are related. Sometimes they're quite different. Um, so I found it useful to keep a vocabulary deck specifically for classical Chinese, so that when I was reviewing that deck, my mind was in classical Chinese mode. Whereas if I was adding this stuff to my regular, like my modern Chinese vocabulary deck, um, it may have gotten more muddled. I'm not sure, but yeah, I found it really useful. Um, and it also helped to, especially in cases where the meanings are different with classical and modern. Um, so yeah, I definitely recommend doing that. Let me go back. I think there were a few questions I skipped earlier, so let me. Um, it was oh, famous classical Chinese text would be the most accessible to people just starting to read classical Chinese. If you're talking about, I mean, if you're talking about like a full text, um, so there's a question from Dong Chinese. If you're talking about a full text as opposed to something like a short passage, because you know these textbooks are all going to have very, especially at the beginning, um, you get very short passages, right? Like sentences in lesson one, right? Um, those are going to be the easiest, obviously, you know, because they're chosen specifically to demonstrate stuff for beginners. But as far as a full text, like once you've got the basics down, for me, I always found Shiji to be pretty approachable. I haven't read the whole thing, of course. I mean, it's huge. I've read a bunch of passages. It's pretty approachable. Um, the Sishu, and this may just reflect my bias because I was learning classical Chinese in order to do paleographic research, and so most of what you read in that field is like Spring and Autumn and Warring States period texts, right? And maybe Han Dynasty. Um, so I mean, there may be later stuff that's actually easier once you have the basics down. I'm not really sure, but I found Shiji to be pretty approachable. Sishu is it's four. Now I'm blanking. It's four books, four classical books, and it's 《论语》《孟子》大学and 中庸, right? So it's two full books and then two like sections of larger books. But those are considered the four classical books of Confucianism. Those are pretty approachable. Mengzi is pretty approachable. Liezi is fairly readable once you've got the basics down. Zhuangzi, I keep coming back to that because it's just so much fun to read. But yeah, once you have the basics down, Warring States stuff is approachable. There's going to be a lot of unfamiliar vocabulary, but the grammar, once you've got the basics of grammar down, especially if you have Polyblank with you, it's pretty approachable. And things like the 说文解字, which we kind of have a reputation of hating on, which is a little unfair. because we don't hate it. We use it all the time. But we just there are issues. So you can't use it as like a reliable source on character structure. You have to cross-reference it with more up-to-date research. But it is good for other things. It's good for how people at the time thought about characters. It's good for meaning. A lot of times, you can pretty much guarantee that if the Schwollen says a character means something, it probably means that. At least it was used that way in classical texts, before the Schwollen was compiled. It's reliable for that. And of course, for character explanations, some of them are reliable. But the explanations are written in a pretty basic, simple classical Chinese. So they're quite readable. And actually, speaking on that, my first semester in grad school, I was in a intro to paleography class. It was like an undergrad paleography class. And it was basically like an intro to the Schwollen. And there was another non-native speaker in my class. She was from Europe. I won't say where because I don't want to call her out, but she hadn't learned any classical Chinese whatsoever. And she was just completely lost. And just a few chapters of Fuller would have helped her a lot. She would have been able to make sense of the stuff in the Schwollen. But yeah, she struggled a lot because she didn't have that. What else? Oh, there's other things like Sanzi Jing. So Sanzi Jing is, let me share my screen again. I'll type the title up on the. I should have made more use of this. Sanzi Jing. And it's like it's a poem that was basically used to teach kids characters and basic classical Chinese. I think it was written maybe in the Tang Dynasty, Song Dynasty maybe. So it's later. And it is a poem, so it's in a very specific structure. It's 3 characters per phrase. That's why it's called the Sanzi Jing. And it's like Ren Zhu Chu, Chu, Xing Ben Shan. Right? It's like this type of structure. And it's funny, I quoted the first line. This is the first line of the poem. I quoted it to my Chinese teacher, and she got so excited. She recited the first 50 lines to me or something like that. So people still use it. Kids still memorize it. At least in Taiwan. I don't know about China, probably. And it's really easy classical Chinese. There's even, I think online there's a few translations into English that you can use too. So that's super approachable. It's really pretty easy to read once you have a few basics down. Another one, which is a little harder, Qian Zi Wen. So this is the 1,000-character classic. It has exactly 1,000 characters, and none of them are repeated, right? So it's 1,000 unique characters, and it's a 4-character structure. So it's Tian Di Xun Huang Yu Zhou Hong Huang. So that's the first line. Now, both of these are primers. They're meant for kids who are learning characters. And so the language is fairly simple. It's not super difficult. And it's also meant to teach basic knowledge. So heaven and earth are dark and yellow. Heaven being dark, the sky. Yellow being, description of the earth, the soil. And the universe is vast and whatnot. So it's like a primer. It teaches basic knowledge. Both of them are like that. They're very different structurally, but they're both good introductory texts if it's something that interests you. I never really spent much time with either of them. I've read through them and stuff, but never worked a lot with them. The Qian Zi Wen is really popular with calligraphers. So there's a lot of like 草书千字文, 草书 like cursive. So if you ever want to learn how to read cursive, and maybe we can do another live stream about that, because that's something I spent a lot of time thinking about, and I have a bunch of resources on. 草书千字文. If you ever want to read cursive, you'll probably want to pick up, some examples of this from different calligraphers. It really helps. Yeah, those are pretty easy text to approach. Let's see. Look at the expert entries that talk about the original character meaning. Sometimes they're so wildly different from the modern meanings that I wonder how this drastic shift happened. Yeah, so this is something I think we can probably do a little bit better job of explaining in the dictionary. Let me pull up an example. So a good one that I like is jiu, meaning 9, the number 9, right? It's a bent arm, and it was borrowed for its sound to write the number 9. Let me see if I can get it to show up, right? So in the meaning tree section of the dictionary, these symbols next to the number actually mean something. And I think if you tap how to use this info, it's there. If you've taken our character course, we spend a full lesson, I think 2 videos, explaining, how to make sense of these meaning trees. But so originally it was a bent arm, borrowed for its sound to mean 9. So that's what, try to get in the center, sorry. That circle next to 9 means that it was borrowed for its sound. That means the meaning 9 is completely unrelated to bent arm, right? So that's what the circle means. And anything below a meaning with that circle is also going to be completely unrelated to the original meaning. So from 9 to many, you can kind of see where there's a semantic connection there. But yeah, and that's indicated by the arrow. In other entries, you might have a double arrow. Like, let me think of one that might have it. Probably shung. This is always a good example. Yeah, okay, so here we go. All right, so this is sheng, like 生活的生. So originally meant grow to emerge. Extended from that is to live or be alive or life. Further extended, and these are logical relationships. These are not necessarily in historical order. This is more about the logical relationship between the meanings. So person is derived from, it's logically extended from to live or be alive, right? Person. And same for uncooked or unprocessed or raw. Like if in Chinese, if you describe something as sheng, whatever, sheng yu is raw fish, right? And then, so those double arrows indicate that it's extended from that single arrow meaning above it. This single arrow is extended from the original meaning. Now, if there was a circle, like let's pretend that entry 4 is a circle. Sorry guys, the lighting is not working very well here, but if entry 4 was a circle, then entry 5 would not be extended from from the original meaning. It would be extended from that sound loan meaning, right? So that anytime you see a circle, anything below it is either related to the circle meaning or related to something else below it, not to the original meaning. So hopefully that clears some things up as far as that goes. And again, like in our character course, we talk about that in pretty great detail, I would say. Mention liking the Shi. Any other classical Chinese texts that you read for fun nowadays? Ah, I wish. Unfortunately, I don't have much time for reading for fun these days. Um, a while back, I started reading Zhuangzi again. I remembered liking it a lot, and so I pulled this back out of storage and pulled up a copy, also on my laptop, and I read a few passages. Um, I've been doing. I'm going through the Shuowen again. I did this a few times in grad school, but I'm going through now and like comparing each entry. And this is gonna, I probably won't finish this project. It's a massive project, but I'm comparing each entry to modern research and making notes. Um, just and I'm spending maybe 20 minutes a day on this or something, but just to like, uh, I guess, brush up on my Schwollen knowledge and also to see in a more systematic way where the issues are in the Schwollen, and like what kinds of things pop up over and over. Um, so that's been really useful, but that's not really classical Chinese literature. Um, I really like if I had time, I would probably go through Gu Wen Guanju. Um, I don't know. That's more of like a skill building exercise, though, rather than reading for pleasure. If I'm reading for pleasure, it's usually something like Zhuangzi, which is fun and interesting. He has stories of him like having philosophical discussions with a skull that he found on the side of the road and stuff like that. Like it's just unusual stuff. Um, Stuff like that or Shiji, because the Shiji stuff that to me is interesting. It's history and whatnot. But um, why do they choose that specific character out of all the possible characters to represent nine? Like, how was there a character for bent arm before there was a character for nine? Okay, so no, this is a good question. It's Some of the numbers derive from like a tally system, like ER-san. Those are all one vertical or one horizontal line, two horizontal lines, three horizontal lines. So those most likely come from some sort of a tally system. There's a few others that may, like the research is there's competing theories, and I think five. Some people say that it comes from tally marks. So you have this thing where there's a tally system that people are using before there's much in the way of writing. So actually, early writing um, partially comes from this system of tallies. Um, at least numerical notation does. But it gets really unwieldy really fast, right? So if you have to write 537, it's hard to do that with tallies. You can do it, but it's not very economical. And when you start, you have to think like, and this is probably a topic for a different video, but before there was writing, there's no even concept of the idea that something can be written down, right? So there's a book about this by Walter Ong called Orality and Literacy. Um, and it basically talks about these pre-literate cultures and how your way of thinking about things is different. Like before there's writing, you don't even think of a word as a physical concept. Like there's no concept of there being a representation of a spoken word. Before writing, a word is just a spoken thing. You say it and it's gone. And if nobody ever says that word ever again, it's just gone, right? Um, so words die out and whatnot. Once you tie the idea that you can, or once you have the idea that you can tie these spoken actions, basically, it's basically an action, right? So, a word is not a physical entity at that point. A word is an action. Um, Once you have the idea that you can tie these spoken words to a physical representation, a visual representation, then the problem becomes how do you do that in a way that's useful, right? So you have if you're trading, say, I'll trade you 3 bolts of cloth for 5 fish, or whatever it is, and you need to make some sort of a record of that. You might use tally marks. That it makes perfect sense to use tally marks. But then once these tally marks become, you can look at, say, this, and say it's 5. You get the idea that you can represent these spoken words with physical, visual representations. And the same thing with clan names. So if you're the sheep clan, you might have a marking that is a kind of an abstraction of a sheep. But then at some point you go, hey, that's young, or whatever the word was for young at that time, right? So likely they had tallies for 9. We don't really know what that was necessarily. I mean, maybe somebody does. That's not really my field of expertise, but you start eventually writing stuff with tallies, writing numbers with tallies gets really unwieldy. So they started borrowing, like the character 4 was a nose breathing out, right? It meant to exhale. But it sounded really similar to the word for 4. So that word to exhale sounded really similar to 4. So they just went, okay, we're going to borrow this and use it to represent 4, and you can figure out which one it is, just based on context. This is getting so deep. I love it. Yeah. I spent a lot of time thinking about this stuff, man. So yeah, you just tend to borrow characters that are pronounced the same way or pronounced very similarly. So it just happened that they had a character for a bent arm that was pronounced almost the same as a character for 9, or the word for 9, sorry. And so they just borrowed that character and used it to write 9, and you're expected to get whether it was a bent arm or 9 from context. Now later on, they changed the character for bent arm and kept the original one for 9, and that's how we got to where we are today. And it's a super common phenomenon in Chinese characters. So that's when you're looking at our dictionary, anytime you see a circle next to a meaning, that's basically what's going on. It happens all the time. So let me see. Did I miss anything else? Yeah. All right. I think I've addressed everyone's questions. I think there was probably something earlier that I said was probably something for a different video. I'll go back through these after this is over, and I'll answer anything I can. If there's any topics, I'm thinking about doing this as like a regular thing. I don't know if it'll be every week or twice a month or something like that. Maybe learning cursive would be a fun topic. That's a really useful skill. I don't know. There's probably a ton of topics we could do. So if there's anything you guys want to see, want to hear me talk about, I'll try to keep it to an hour next time. We're pushing an hour and a half now, or a little over an hour and a half. But yeah, let's do this again, guys. This was kind of fun. Hopefully I covered everything. And again, if you have any questions, post in the comments or send me an email. All right, guys. Take care.